So it is 1 o'clock. I suggest we will start with the first presentation. Not everyone who joined this morning is here, but I expect they will be come back from their lunch. So for those who are new, please, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. If you have a technical problem or another question that is not related to the content of this webinar, but to practical issues, use the chat. So this afternoon, we will go more in practical way. And the first presentation that I will give is what is a hospital exemption, an in-house test and the hospital exemption. What does it mean? What do we need to do? And it is very difficult to explain this in a short period because you can have training for a week for this, but I will try to do my best. So I prepare several topics that are necessary for hospital exemption and why it is important. You saw already this slide by Elisabeth van Biometa-Lyons. In the field of genetics, we have quite a lot of in-house IVD tests which have impact from the IVDR, so that we need to justify the use of our in-house IVD test. And for genetic tests, this is higher than for the other disciplines. So what is important to know, we have one article, Article 5.4 and Article 5.5, together with Annex 1, what is explaining what we need to do. It is explaining or just saying you need to have this, this, and this. It is not really explaining what we need to do. It's a little bit like we work already with other requirements, like, for instance, the 15189 ISO standard. It's not saying what we need to do. It's saying you need to have something that gives an answer to this. So the first point is we cannot transfer a device to another legal entity. The question is, what is a device? The device we cannot transfer to another legal entity, but what we can transfer is still our laboratory protocol. If we have an instruction, the procedure, then we can transfer this to a colleague so that they can start and see where they can use this protocol. Information about the technology, the tools, reagents is still possible. That's not a device, that's not related to this item. And patient samples, according to the definition, are not considered as being a device. So if we send a patient to another legal entity, it's not that we are sending a device to another legal entity, it's just a patient, and the patient can be tested in that legal entity, in that health institution, by a CE-IVD, or if they have hospital exemption for their LDT, they can test it with an LDT. But the important is that we need to be compliant for the hospital exemption. This element of Article 5.5 must be, we need to comply from now, so 2022. So important to know, this must already in place in your laboratory. If we look to element B and C, that need to be compliant in 2024. This is related to the quality management system. And we have already questions in the morning, this morning, about what is the difference about 5189 and the difference about manufacturing. So it is important to know, if we look to B, the manufacture and use of an in-house IVD under an appropriate, proper quality management system. The question is, can we, in our quality management system that we have, according to 5189 or national equivalent, can we be compliant that you can find back how the manufacturing is done for our kit? And do we have all the controls written in our procedure that we take to be sure that if we make a kit, because we need now to think, when are we a user and when are we making a kit? That's a complete different way of thinking. When we are making a kit that we will use for analyzing a patient sample, for making that kit, we need to be sure that we have control about all the elements. What is the control from the research use only reagents that come in? Do we have a control? Can we be satisfied about this? Is this a correct reagent? And all these things. And the same for the instruments. And to bring these different devices, reagents together and instruments, the design, is this still okay? And how is the design written down, traceable in our quality management system? So perhaps your quality management system is already organized in such a way that you have all these manufacturing issues, but perhaps not. And we cannot say it because it's difficult to say it from here, because each quality management system is different organized. And if you're accredited according to 15189, the focus of this accreditation is not how you make the kit. The focus is you do the test and they are looking, you analyze a sample, what are you doing? And what are your controls to see if the test that you are using, the kit that you are using, is that using correctly. They are not looking, is the kit you developed correctly before you use it. So the focus is different. So what is important to know? There is an official journal of the European Union, and last month they at an amending, and they say that 2 ISO standards, the 13485, which is the quality management system with the requirements for regulatory purposes for medical devices, and they have another one for risk management systems. So these 2 documents, the journal say these are good to use. You can use them voluntarily, but if you follow these documents, you are more or less answering the legal requirements that are mentioned in the IVDR. So I can only advise, buy these 2 ISO documents and start using them together with your quality management system that you have already, because there you will learn more. How do I need to look? How do I plan, design this kit? And which kind of documents do we need to have? Or in which way we need to rewrite our procedure so that if we have a visit, if we need to say that we are compliant to for hospital exemption, that we can really say, yes, in this document you find the elements that is needed for that we manufacture our kit correctly in a proper quality management system. So these are 2 important ISO standards. If we continue, for D and A, that need to be compliant in 28, so we have still time. So this goes to tell us that we need to look if the kit which is on the market, if this is good for us to use, or is our in-house kit that we make and we have another kit on the market better, and in what way it is better. And we need to provide this information. So the kit that is on the market have unmet needs, and therefore we developed an in-house kit, or therefore we redesign the kit so that we have all this information. So important to know, we come further to this, the information and the rationale to the authorities, we have a deadline till 28. The reason therefore is that we will find all the CE IVD kits from class C and also from D, B, and A. We will find them in the EUDAMED database, which is the European database for medical devices. And there you will find all the information about this kit and the performance characteristics. And as I told you this morning, for class C, all this information will be available in 2026. So we will have 2 years additional time to do this comparison study. So we are lucky in that way. So, but it's important that you look to this from 26, but you can only compare if you have already done your performance evaluation and if you have already your performance characteristics, so that you can compare them with what is on the market. So, and this is something that is mentioned in Annex 1. If we go to F, that's publishing in 2024, that we need to be compliant with this. This is, we need to publish the name of our in-house device, the address of our organization, and the identification of the products, which different products are in our in-house kit. And we need to declare that we are conform Annex 1. So conform Annex 1, in the coming slides we will come to this. This need to be in rule in 2022. So now we need normally to have all our Annex 1 answers for each in-house test. So, but in 2024, we need to make it public available. And therefore, you need to go back to your national law and to your competent authority, how they will organize it in Belgium, because they are responsible to guide us to bring these in-house kits. Also, they need to be public available in a system that others can have a look what is ongoing in that lab, like the companies need to do it also. But we need to do this in 2024. So, but we need already to be in rule at the moment about this. The only thing is we have still some time to think about our name of our kit. So, and also important to know, but we will come later, from now on, the competent authority can always come inside and have a look. The next point, this is more about Class D, but we have an important remark. So in the regulation, the European regulation, it's mentioned that we need to have extensive documentation on the manufacturing, design, performance, and compliance to Annex 1 for Class D products. Why is mentioned here Class D products? If you could hear this morning about what the tasks are from the reference laboratory, the reference laboratory will verify if these Class D products are okay. They will do tests again. So therefore, they need really to have a lot of documentation so that they can review it. It's not for us, for in-house tests, that we need to send them to a reference lab, but the competent authority must do the same on based of our documents. So they need to have sufficient information that they can say, yes, that laboratory with an in-house Class D product, high-risk product for the patient, they did enough to assure the quality for the patient and the population. So we don't need to send it to a reference lab, but based on this extensive documentation, the competent authority will be sure that what we are doing by designing performance, that this is okay. What is important with this asterisk? This is one of the freedom that each national country can have, So the member states may apply this provision also to Class C, B, and E. In some countries, like Germany, they put it already also for Class C, B, and D. In Belgium, we will have it also for Class C. Is there a big difference? It's difficult to say no, because it's still waiting and based on experience and discussion and going in discussion with our competent authority, what they understand about extensive documentation. Because we have already a lot of documentations in our validation reports, what we are doing, but we need also to say that we are sure we have no issue about the quality. We are sure that our test is working correctly. We are sure that our test in the life cycle approach is working correctly. Also 5 years later, when we developed the test, that we follow up all the non-conformities and did again risk analysis. So is there a big difference? We need to wait, but the difference in feeling that they can ask it and that they oblige us to us makes it so difficult to accept this sentence. So, and H will say that we need to manufacture these products according to the documents. So this need to be in rule in 2024. That's a kind also of related to our documentation system that we need to bring, I cannot say to bring it a level higher, but to bring it a level to manufacturing. So I think the level will be the same, but we need to have a focus on manufacturing. We need also to collect experience gained from the clinical use and apply corrective action. This is also something that is mentioned in the 15189 standard, but there we are looking more global and not always on test level. Now we need to say on a regular basis, these are all the non-conformities related to this test, or these are the non-conformities related to these reagents we have and that affect all these in-house IVD tests. So reorganize a little bit our way of working in our quality management system to collect this information all together in the way that we need to give feedback to our competent authority when requested. Also for the clinical use, perhaps we need to have more contacts than we have now in our institute with the clinicians who ask for the test. We need to illustrate that we have really feedback from them, that we see that our test is okay or not okay. This is what is called in the IVD regulation as post-market surveillance. So beside these fragments, we have 3 general centers in the IVDR, and I will go with you also through this. The first one is from the general centers. If we look with the focus to the laboratories, an in-house IVD must comply to the general safety and performance requirements, and that is written in Annex 1. So it's only one sentence to explain that we need to comply for 20 additional requirements, and in these 20 additional requirements, there are sub-requirements. So it's quite a lot. So in addition, as I mentioned this morning, there are requirements for devices manufactured and used in health institution established oversight. So if a European person is test oversight, they need to follow also this regulation. And the question will be, if we as health institutions send the sample to the other site, to US, who shall we follow up that that lab is performing the regulation? And here is a little bit tricky, because 15189, if you are accredited for 15189, but perhaps also your national requirements for accreditation ask that you verify what kind of laboratory you are using, that you check the quality of the laboratory. And somewhere in the ISO document, it's also mentioned that you need to follow the regulation of your country. This European regulation is a regulation of your country. So even in 15189, we need to take this into account, that we need to verify if we send the lab to another laboratory and they use an in-house test, that this is that this complies to the in-house hospital exemption. How that other lab need to register this in our Belgian system, this is a question that we need to ask, or in your country, to our competent authority. And also the in-house IVD exemption is only valid if you do not do it on industrial scale. We will hear later today, industrial scale is not really a number. It's when you start commercialize your product and you are really doing a business. So you leave a little bit out the healthcare focus. Then general statements for the member states. They may always ask additional information. They have the right to. They have the right to restrict the manufacturer. So they can say, no, you cannot further manufacture this in-house device. They have the right. Of course, they need to give some arguments why, but they have the right. They have also the right to use the use of any specific type of such device. They say, yes, it's a nice device, but that type of device you cannot use anymore in Belgium. We see it already for some devices in Germany. They're a little bit advanced that they already mentioned it. And also for the MDR, you have already issues that are already published in the national law. And we shall always give permission to our competent authority to inspect our laboratory. So we need to keep the door always open for them. So these are all rules that need to fulfill in 2022. if we go to the Annex 1, which is the general safety and performance requirements with 20 items, you can divide them in 3 chapters. And Annex 1 is a good starting point to do the exercise and to see how strong your quality management system is at the moment to comply with your in-house device test that you would like to continue to use. So you need to answer to Annex 1. So, and you can make from each element, you can make a checkbox and give information where you can find your documents for that specific element. But to fill in that document, it is important that the person who is doing it, or the team that is doing it, that they know your quality management system, they know how you develop, design, manufacture your kit before you do the test, and that you also, how you monitor your procedure, because you need to have a lot of elements traceable, and perhaps you have it, but the person who need to register that need to know the process and how you do it, and which standards are followed. So an external consultant can tell you what you need, but they cannot tell you, I will fill it in, because they will miss information. So perhaps if the consultant is already working for 5 years in your lab, perhaps they can do it. But most of the time, and my experience is also that the people on the bench in the wet lab who are doing the interpretation of this test, who is responsible for this test, together with the quality manager, need to fulfill this annex. Yes, we did in Leuven the exercise where we took one test, and we did it in 2021, where we were looking about the Dutch document that was drafted by the task force, and they were looking, if you have a 15189 quality system, which elements are covered and which none. This is documented, and we have in the coming, one of the authors will be present this document. In this document, they mentioned that 70% of the requirements in Annex 1 are nearly covered by the requirements of ISO 15189. Our exercise in Leuven came, it's a practical exercise, not a theoretical one, because theoretically you can explain quite a lot, but finding the documents and where this answer to that specific check element in Annex 1 was more difficult. So we came to around 60%. We are less positive about the requirements of ISO 15189. And no, for that test, we were already more than 15 years accredited and have already passed a lot of accreditation cycles where the external auditors were looking to it, and where we improved the test during the time also. So I think our case study is not lying, but it's not so happy news. So for if we go to chapter 1, there from Annex 1, there are general requirements, and the first one is the most important, because then you can go to the next steps. So the intended purpose, the safety of the patient and the user of other persons. We need to write down what is the intended purpose, how do we do the safety of the patient, the users and other persons. And then we need to do a real risk analysis. The risk analysis is something that is also mentioned in 15189 and in a lot of other quality management requirements, but mostly it is only looking to doing the risk analysis and the risk evaluation, but it's not going in that depth what is now asking in the 14,971 standard, which was mentioned in the official journal of the European Union. They ask a whole cycle. You need to have a plan, you need to redo it, and you need also to look differently. What is the possible problem that can happen? We need to look to the patient, to the users. What if they misuse your test? Sometimes, mostly in our quality management system, we are saying you can only use the test if you have the competence to do this. But in this risk management system, they ask that you as manufacturing, because we are still at the side of developing and making our own kit, that we need to foresee all the things that can go wrongly by the user. So, and it can be if he is not trained and he starts using it, it's not really the case, but this is a kind of risk control that we implement then. So we need to have a broader risk management system than we are used to do. In addition, we needed to do it on test level. On test level, I mean on each in-house IVD device. Most of the time when you see risk management figures, you look to the pre-analytical phase, you look to that phase, you look to that phase, but not really specific to each individual test. You can reuse different actions, you can reuse different templates that are partially the same for the others, but we need to find a system how we need to implement this. So this is quite a new implementation, but as some of you perhaps know, in the revision of the 15189 standard and also in 17025 for those who are using this in other countries, the risk management thinking is coming in all the quality management standards. So it's not a lose of energy. We need to do it. So, and we need to come to an acceptable risk level. So when you do it, you do some risk control. You need to come to an acceptable level of risk. You need to identify what is your acceptable level, what are the risks that you accepted, and then we need to review based on all the non-conformities, the feedback you receive from your clinicians and the use of this kit and from the users and from the patients. We need to use these elements again to see if the acceptable risk is were correctly, or did we oversee something, and where can we be better in the next round of the risk management plan. If we go to chapter 2, there it's very important, the first element again, the performance characteristics. So what is our kit? What are the performance characteristics? And then you think, yes, ISO 151 is saying, yes, we need to have a validation report. And that's mostly the analytical performance. But for the performance studies, for the performance characteristics, they're revising that we need to do the performance studies. And if we look what is a performance study in our regulation, then they say it's the part is the scientific validity, the analytical performance, and the clinical performance. In our pilot study, we didn't see all these elements in very much detail. And based on discussions we have with other groups, we understand that that we need to do a little bit more than is mentioned or than we are used to do it in our quality system for medical laboratories. What is also important to know, and you need again to look back to your national law. In the IVDR, it's mentioned that the performance study shall be subject to scientific and ethical review. To which ethical committee do you need to send your application that you would like to do something? This is a discussion point in more countries. You need to look in your national law. You need to follow the guidelines from your national competent authority, because this can be implemented a little bit different from country to country. They have the freedom, but what you need to do must be the same. But where and where you need to do it can be different. What is the same? So you need to have an ethical and scientific review. So there is a guidance document about the general principle for clinical evidence for in vitro diagnostic medical device, and that gives already information how you can do this performance study. As I told you, we can discuss this a whole afternoon to explain this, but this is an important document, and then what you already know about validation, it's really valuable, but we need to do a little bit more. The other topics in Annex 2 are also important, but quite often you can say, no, for this, it's not again. Protection against radiation, not applicable for our test. So that can be also an answer. Right? If we go to chapter 3, requirements regarding the information supplied with the device, it's the label, is the information on the label. This is mostly not applicable for in-house IVDs, but we need to put attention because we need to have a quality management system that is looking to the manufacturing. So we need to be sure that our subs are adapted, that you can explain how your kit is manufactured. We need to have information on the safety, the expiring of the production date. And most of the time we have an expire date of the reagents, but not of our kit that we will use in our test. The storing conditions and the traceability during the whole process need to be implemented already now. So we did the pilot exercise in the summer of 21, where we used different guidelines which were available at that moment, and we make a template where we put the information that we think we have already in our quality system. So this is a template that we think we need for documentation of the hospital exemption. So they are circulated already in some countries templates for helping and guiding us, but most of us are waiting on the guidelines document that will be published soon about hospital exemption. So to finalize this, so what we did in Leuven, we bring all the documents that we have in our quality system together for one test. And then we make a big document for the hospital exemption. And we make also some separate documents, like for the risk management system, for the general safety performance requirements. And in this document, we refer to all the elements where you can find, because this is what we need to explain to our competent authority. And if you look to this figure, this is the same with a little bit colors, then you see how darker the green becomes, or the blue, depending on how your screen is looking. We have a later implementation date. But if you see this, we know that we need to start working on the conformity. And we can do already things, but for clinical evidence, we need to do a little bit more. General safety requirements, yes, we have some issues, but we need to do more. Manufacturing the device, yes, we are manufacturing now. Yes, we need to have a procedure now, but completely enroll with an appropriate quality system, we can wait. We have 2 years time, not waiting, I think. So this was in a nutshell, what is hospital exemption. I advise you to look what kind of documentation is already available in your quality management system, because it's depending how you develop it, and what you have already, because I do quite a lot of external audits, and I see sometimes a lab is doing more than 5189 is asking, so they have perhaps already quite a lot of requirements of the 30 or 40% that we need to fulfill to be in rule with Annex 1. So, and start developing a template which is manageable for your quality management system, where you can explain to your people in the lab or to your colleagues, depending who is making the template. This you can find in our quality system there. Mostly we document it in the validation report, or this is mentioned in the general procedure, or this is mentioned there and there. So we can start, we need to start, because we need to be compliant already. And we know the European Commission, and Olga can ensure this, is working very hard and pushing that the guidance documents which are in preparation will be published soon, so that we have more information if we do not understand the law correctly. But no, the law is the law, and the content of the law will not change at this moment. So it's just how can we answer to the law and what is really expected. But no, it is the same story as we had in the beginning for implementing the 15189 ISO standard. Here I would like to stop my presentation. The next presenter is Jeroen Poels. Jeroen Poels is an officer at our competent authority body in Belgium, but I invite him to give a presentation about the guidelines that are published, because it is the competent authority of Belgium, together with the European Commission, that are in charge for the guidance document for the hospital exemption. And Jeroen will explain us and give us more information about these guidelines and what we can expect in the near future.
So good afternoon, my name is Jeroen Poels, and I was asked to give a short overview of the different guidance documents that help with a harmonized implementation of the IVDR. But before going into that, just a few words on the IVDR itself and its main stakeholders. So as you know, in terms of legislation, we went from an IVD directive to an IVD regulation. And this means that there is less room for interpretation between the different member states, but also that this regulation really tightens the conditions that need to be fulfilled before IVDs can be brought to the European market. And this switch was indeed quite needed, given the fast evolution that IVDs have undergone and are still undergoing. So, and this slide is just an example of this evolution. So on the left, you will find the more manual, tedious diagnostic procedures. And if you go to the right, you see more and more smaller devices, more and more automation, and also high throughput devices. So since last May, the IVDR finally applies after having been published since 2017. And because there are so many changes involved for IVDs, we do tend to speak of the IVDR storm rather than the IVDR application. And some of the most important changes are being described in the next slide, because those are needed to understand the rest of the presentation. So just briefly, what are these changes that are brought about by this new regulation? Well, obviously, one of the major changes is the way by which devices are classified. We went from a list-based system to a risk-based system. And in this last system, Class D devices pose the highest risk to the patient as well as to public health. Secondly, there is a huge shift when it comes to notified body involvement. So while under the directive, only 10 to 15% of devices needed a notified body, under the regulation, this amount has increased to almost 90%. And then finally, another aspect that has gained a lot of attention, and rightfully so, is the clinical evidence that is needed before an IVD can be placed on the market. So in addition to that, there are some really new aspects. For instance, we now have an IVD expert panel, and we will have in the near future European reference labs that will check the performance of Class D devices before they can be placed on the market. But also afterwards, these labs will perform tests on batches of manufactured Class D devices. And then finally, there are some special rules regarding companion diagnostics, where now the Medicines Agency is involved. And there's also new rules regarding in-house devices, to which I will come back later. So all these changes that are implemented in the new legislation lead to a whole lot of different types of documents. 2 core agenda to the IVDR have already been published, and 1 new regulation was published this January, and this differs some of the provision of in-house IVDs, but it also amends the transitional provisions of the IVDR. And then there's a few implementing acts that have an influence on IVDs. For instance, the implementing act on the European database for medical devices, implementing acts on the designation of notified bodies, the designation of expert panels, and the designation of UDI entities. And then very recently, last week, in fact, 2 implementing acts have been published regarding the functioning of European Union reference labs, one on tasks and criteria for these labs, and one on fees that these labs can ask for their services. And then one important upcoming act for IVDs is the act on common specifications for certain Class D IVDs. So in addition to these legally binding documents, there are also more informal documents such as position papers, infographics, fact sheets, Q&A documents, and then of course, obviously, there's the guidelines, the guidance documents. So there's already quite a lot of those. More than 80 have been published so far by the Medical Device Coordination Group or by the Commission. So I mentioned the Medical Device Coordination Group, or the MDCG, in the previous slide as one of the major players contributing to these guidance documents. And the MDCG is chaired by the Commission. It has all the different competent authorities as members. And under the MDCG, so far, 13 subgroups have been formed, and these subgroups really have special focuses, for instance, on vigilance, market surveillance, notified bodies. And then, of course, there's the subgroup that focuses on IVDs. As regard the process of decision-making in the MDCG, most documents that the MDCG produces are reached by consensus, but there is always the possibility of voting by majority. So I listed 2 of the MDCG's tasks here. As one of the main missions is indeed the development of guidance documents that ensure the harmonized implementation of the IVDR. But the MDCG also contributes to the development of common specification and harmonized standards. So these 2 tasks are just 2 examples that are relevant to this talk, actually. So where does the MDCG get all its information from, or what other groups does it cooperate with? Obviously, there are the different departments of the European Commission and the Joint Research Center, which is a part of the European Commission. There's the competent authorities that actually participate in the MDCG, but the competent authorities also have their own group called the CAAMD. And then in the near future, there will be the European reference labs that will provide input to the MDCG, the expert panels. And then there's this large group of stakeholders that contains industry, healthcare organizations, authorized representative associations, etc. And since recently, the European Medicines Agency is one of the cooperating groups as well. For instance, for the conformity assessment of companion diagnostics. And then, of course, there is one of the major players in the whole legislative system, notified bodies that mainly interact with the MDCG via their notified body coordination group. So depending on the topic, there's a lot of different groups that will influence or have input in the guidelines the MDCG produces. So where can you find these guidance documents? I provided a link here, and they are always turned by MDCG, then the year of publication and the number. So in terms of procedure, I focused now on the IVD subgroup of the MDCG. So this IVD subgroup has a draft work program, and in this work program, sometimes it's decided to work on a guidance document for certain topics. And what generally happens then is that competent authorities volunteer to cooperate on this. And these task forces are led by the Commission or sometimes by the competent authorities. So when it comes to stakeholders' involvement, it's ad hoc. Well, on an ad hoc basis, decided whether to include stakeholders straight away or not. For instance, for the guidance on in-house devices, it was decided that there would be first a draft by the competent authorities, because competent authorities needed to harmonize their views first before a first draft could be written. So generally, after this first draft, there is a consultation round where the draft is sent to the whole IVD subgroup, to stakeholders, but also to other MDCG subgroups if those are implemented as well. So generally, this consultation round is accompanied by a template for comments. So associations can write comments to the text and propose changes. And then it's really up to the subgroup that is drafting the guidance to accept these comments or reject them or partially accept them. So they can provide comments on their decisions as well in this table. Then most of the times there is a second draft, there's a possibility of a second consultation round, but this is not always the case. And then finally, there's endorsement by the MDCG and publication on the MDCG's website. In terms of timelines, this really depends on the topic. For instance, whether there has been a previous version of a similar guidance that can be used as a starting point, it will speed up the process. Obviously, it also depends on how extensive the subject is. For instance, the classification guidance is almost a 50-page document. Other guidances are just 5 pages. And then it also depends on how urgent it is to produce these guidances. Are these guidances legally binding? The short answer is no, they are not. So it's only the Court of Justice of the European Union that can give binding interpretation of union law. But that being said, most involved parties do take into account the content of guidance documents. So it's always extremely useful to read them and to try to follow them, of course. So I now listed a few examples of guidance documents, and obviously it will be no surprise that many recent guidance documents deal with COVID-19 specific issues. So there's a few guidances for medical devices related to COVID-19, being guidances for ventilators, for medical face masks, for 3D printed medical devices. But the majority of guidances obviously deals with SARS-CoV-2 tests. And 2 quite general documents were published. The first one is a Q&A document that contains information on the conformity assessment for IVDs. And this document has also been translated in non-European languages such as Japanese and Chinese. And the other document is a notice to manufacturers specifically from outside the EU if they wish to place devices on the European market. And both documents were really needed as this COVID crisis produced a lot of new manufacturers from abroad that did not know about the European laws or legislation. So after that, a more technical guidance document was released in March 2021. And this one describes the state of the art for COVID-19 rapid antibody test. And here the state of the art was approached by analyzing more than 100 instructions for use of rapid antibody tests that were already out there on the market. So this guidance then describes some very basic principles such as interference studies, cross-reactivity testing, the number of samples to be analyzed, minimal specificity and sensitivity values, and so on. So this was quite useful. Now for lab-based antibody tests, what we did in Belgium in the very beginning of the pandemic was to cooperate with Belgian clinical labs to analyze these tests in real-life circumstances. And the 2 graphs below are a summary of that exercise, where we did indeed find some underperforming tests in terms of either sensitivity or specificity. And I think it is a legitimate question to ask why some of these tests could be legally placed on the market bearing a CE mark. And the reason is that these tests were still under the directive regime, which means that they did not have to be checked by a notified body. There were no specific performance specifications for those. But this is really a good example of a test that will be regulated much more stringently from now on, as it will fall under Class D in the IVDR, meaning there will be a notified body involved, there will be a European reference lab involved, well, probably. There will be common specifications, so the situation will definitely improve when it comes to tests like this. So in 2021, notice was also published about the impact of genetic variants, and this was really more directed to manufacturers and underlying their responsibility to assess the impact of newly identified genetic variants on their SARS-CoV-2 tests. And then later that year, probably the most important document for COVID-19 tests was published, which is a guidance on performance evaluation of SARS-CoV-2 tests. And this guidance really sums up all the different types of tests and lists in 7 tables, I believe, the performance criteria that every test should meet, whether it being a professional test or a self-test. So as an example, I took the table from for the antigen tests, and this gives you an indication of the number of positive and negative samples to test, what samples to test, the sensitivity and specificity values that one should obtain, etc. And well, it's important to mention that this guidance document also served as a basis for the development of common specifications for SARS-CoV-2 tests under the IVDR. So in the future, the data in this guidance will be transferred to CS, and all tests will have to follow these specifications. So regarding non-COVID related guidance documents. So one of the earliest guidances that was to be released is about the classification rules. And this is really a seminal document, as it contains a description of the different classification rules and of their sub-rules. So in principle, there is only 7 classification rules, which seems quite straightforward. But there's also a lot of sub-rules, and a guidance on this was really needed. And actually, this guidance is also very useful to classify in-house devices with. And about this guidance, in the near future, very near future, a small revision will be published that updates the part on companion diagnostics and also elaborates a bit on the classifications of some types of control materials. Then a second more general important document is the guidance on clinical evidence for IVD, where the basic principles of planning and gathering clinical evidence are explained. So, and this annex in this guidance really nicely lays out the different steps to take from scientific validity to analytical performance to clinical performance. And it also details that this information gathering is a continuous process. So it does not end once you reach this step. It's a process that will have to go on throughout the life cycle of the device. The other annex in this document describes what reports relating to clinical evidence are needed, and there's quite a lot of those, but also how frequently these reports need to be updated. Right, and then as you can imagine, there's quite a number of guidances specific to Class D IVDs, as the conformity procedure for Class D devices is the most stringent one and complex one. So the first document here is about the transitional provisions. That is less relevant now, as it dealt with placing Class D devices on the market before the IVDR applied. The second one is when and how the IVD expert panel should be involved in assessing a Class D device. And then the last guidance here is about the verification that notified bodies should perform with batches of manufactured Class D devices. Then there are two guidances that deal with the transitional provisions that apply to some devices. For instance, a Class D device can still be placed on the market until 2025 using the directive legislation. The same goes for Class C devices until 2026 and Class B devices even until 2027. So basically, there's this stepwise approach for applying the IVDR. After those dates, these devices need to follow the IVDR before being placed on the market. So after 2025, all Class D devices will have to follow the IVDR. These devices cannot just use the IVDD, so the IVD directive legislation. There's a few conditions that need to be fulfilled before they can do this. And one of the conditions is the fact that this device that is placed on the market under the IVD directive legislation does not undergo a significant change in its intended purpose or in the design. And for exactly this purpose, a guidance document was written that explains what changes are considered significant. This was indeed one of those guidance documents that was produced really quickly because of the urgency of the matter. And then this second one here is linked with the first one, as it describes what provisions of the IVDR already apply to those devices that are still placed on the market under the directive. So it's not as if nothing of the IVDR will apply to those devices. Some requirements do apply, and this guidance document provided some useful information on that. So also in this year, a guidance has been published that describes the template that manufacturers can use for their summary of safety and performance, or what is also called the SSP document. So this is a document that will be made publicly available via UDAMED. It's needed for Class C and D IVDs, and it does describe in some detail the intended use of the device. It also provides a description of the IVD, the risks associated with the IVD, and then a summary of the performance. So in that respect, it will be really useful for healthcare institutions that manufacture in-house devices, because they can use this information when they scan the market for CE marked devices that might be equivalent to their in-house device. And then finally, this May, a guidance was published that describes the use of IVDs in medicine clinical trials, but this one is actually more like a Q&A document. So what about guidances in development? First, there is, of course, the guidance on in-house devices. So a first draft was being produced. And in this draft, so this is the article that talks about in-house devices in the IVDR. So it's article 5.5. And in this article, several terms have been identified that could do with some extra guidance. And actually, the numbers here refer to the headings in the guidance document that is to be drafted. So after this first round, there was a consultation round with stakeholders, with different competent authorities, and then the second draft has been produced. A few weeks ago, we held a workshop, or more a discussion on this second draft, and then we received another round of comments that still need to be analyzed in the next task force meeting. And after that, the guidance will be sent to the MDCG for endorsement and for publication. So other IVD-related guidances that have been produced or are under construction are, for example, a document that will look on how the IVDR allows to respond to an urgent health crisis. And obviously this is a result of the COVID crisis to have a look at that. Other guidances that are still being developed relate to notified bodies. There's also already a lot of guidances for notified bodies. Then there's a upcoming guidance for the periodic safety update reports that manufacturers have to provide for Class C and D IVDs. There will be a guidance about post-market surveillance requirements. There's already a lot of documents on UDI already, on UDAMED and so on. And so you can find the titles of these guidance also on the MDCG's website. So as I mentioned, all documents can be found on the MDCG website, and then also the Commission published some very interesting fact sheets on its website. Right, so with this, I hope I have not completely overloaded you with all these guidance documents, and to make things worse, I should say. This is obviously just a snapshot of all the guidances that are out there and that we know of today, because more will come. Obviously, they will not all be of interest to you, but some are, I guess, and are definitely worth being looked at. So with this, I thank you for your attention.
Okay, for the questions, I first want to thank Els for taking us into some detail on Article 5 and, of course, Article 1 that is closely related. And then for Jeroen, who gave us a lot of information on the guidance document. And this is actually the starting point. I would like to say that in those guidance documents, there is also already an answer to some of the questions that have been asked in the Q&A. I want to group the questions. Otherwise, we will be here for the entire day, as Els pointed out earlier. The first question is about what can be transferred to other institutes. So on the one hand, for instance, can we go into another institute and use, say, a sequencing facility? And then what about our recipients that we may send to the other laboratories and other reagents? I'm not sure, this is a broad question, I think, if you can answer to that. Let me tell you that Jeroen has not been able to join this afternoon for unforeseen reasons. So the questions are to us or to the other people.
Yes, the question is quite broad, and I need to split them in two elements. Related to the collection material of samples, if you make your own collection material and you send it to other health institutions which are not belonging to your legal identity, because if it is a health institution that is situated in the other part of the town, but it's still your legal identity, then there is no case. So if you make your own collection material, you buy 5 liters of culture media and you put them in small items, you label them just to inform the user what it's inside, and you transfer it to another legal identity, then you're manufacturing, and then it's not an in-house anymore because you sent it to another legal identity, so you cannot transfer it anymore. You need to buy collection material with a CE label on it. Or what you can do, because most of the time these are not sterile products, and you can mention it to your competent authority. You need to fulfill the documents. You need to label it like Chapter 3 in Annex 1 with specific labels that are mentioned in the IVDR. So you have 4 categories that you can follow. And so that is something that you need to do, but you can still use it and you don't need a notified body if it is not sterile so far. So that for this, other issues you can transfer if a reagent, but you cannot, if a reagent is made by yourself, be careful. If it is a general laboratory use, you can transfer it, but I think you better discuss it with your own competent authority, what is allowed and not allowed, because don't make it too complex for yourself. So I think if you just do what you need to do, then there was also a question, Gert, and I'm not sure you fix it to this, using other instruments in another institute. That's again the same question. Is it a legal one, not a legal one? Is it very important or not? It's always the question, who is responsible? How do you have control on that instrument? What is the intended purpose? And how sure are you that what they planning to do or telling to you that they are doing, if this is still correct, because you are responsible for your device or the test that you are doing.
Second question that popped up again is like, what is an LDT test? Where does it start? Where does it end? I think this has been answered by Olga already, that indeed it's the entire flow, including software, including reagents. So I think we shall not go into detail on that.
Yes,
one.
Perhaps I need to say something about this. You need to look to the definition of what is an in-house, and to the definition of a medical device, of an IVD device. And then you need to see, if you develop your test, where you can say this is a device and this is a device. Sometimes it's complete. You cannot say these are two separate devices. Sometimes you can say yes. But it's again what Olga was saying, it's depending on the intended use based in your process. So sometimes you can have two devices making from one test, sometimes not.
Somehow related is a question about the plastics we use, and also the pre-analytical, I think the sample tubes and so on. Where are they to be situated? And I guess the same applies for, say, extraction kits and so on. Are they to be separately considered? And I think this is also a question of what is class A, what is class B in the context of our genetic laboratories somehow.
Yes, but general equipment is class E normally, but the depending is, but if you start with extraction, you start to handle your sample. If you buy plastics and you do their reagent in it and you do a part of a process, then you can say that that plastic is an equipment, a tool, a device that I use. And if it is not available on the market for CE use, if it is not available and only for research use only, you can use research use only products. But then the question is, how do you implement in your quality system that you control a research use only product, that the quality that you of the product that you buy, that you can trust this? How do you arrange this in your quality management system? So you need to be sure that what you are using, that this is correct. And when you have a CE label on it, you know exactly what is expected, and this is controlled to use further in the diagnostics.
But you mentioned research use only, and there is a question to ask for a bit of clarification. Well, I could answer already that research use only kits do not at all exempt you from LDT dossiers and files or in-house testing. Would you comment on this? I think an LDT, whether it's labeled research use only or not, does not change anything in terms of the requirements that you have to fulfill, correct?
A research use only product is not mentioned in the IVDR.
Not at all.
As we use different research use only products and we change the intended purpose of these three, of the combination, then we make a product and then it belongs to the IVDR. It's again the intended purpose.
It's certainly not an excuse to not file an LDT dossier. Sorry, I use LDT rather than in-house, but people know they are equivalent. Moving to about the targets patient groups. So when do I have enough difference in my target patient group to say that your in-house is different from the CE kit? That's a bit a gray zone question, I think, else there is no
Yes, the target population group so far, what you read in discussion groups and in papers is, if a kit is coming on the market for adults and you need to like it to be tested for children, then your target population group is changed. You can discuss, is this off-label use or not off-label use, become it an LDT or not. Therefore, we are waiting for the guidance document of hospital exemption when we need to use this. That's the target population. Another issue can be that you use it for diagnostics or you use it for screening. That's also a difference of the intended purpose.
And I think that the guidance document is also adding that if the performance of your kit is much better than the commercial kit, you're also allowed to kind of diverge. But again, you need to fulfill all the criteria. But that's very clear in the guidance document, I think. Then finally, how do we apply for the hospital exemption? I think this is to go through your national authority, of course. And the last one is, are there any exceptions planned for rare diseases? And I can only smile when I read that question.
Exceptions, I think the law is the law. What we can say is that the board asked also to other projects ongoing about rare disease to help them together to see if we can find a way in the future that we can still do that work for the patients.
Because the number of tests you're doing, nor the fact that it's more expensive, there are no criteria as exemptions per se today. So it's not because you do it 5 times a year that it's exempt from the...
It's a little bit what Elisabeth was saying this morning, if you do it 5 times a year, but that, depending how, do we have only 5 patients overall the world, or do we have overall the world 300 patients? So that's already a difference.
There was a few questions, but they relate more to what are the rules for when you really become a manufacturer. I think a manufacturer of a real CE IVD kit, but I think they're a bit too detailed in terms of the different ISO norms that have to be fulfilled. So I would like to, sorry for the people that asked it, but try to not address it right now. It's quite detailed, I think.
There were some basic questions about the different ISO norms. So you don't, if you use an in-house IVD device and you would like to continue use it, you don't need to be accredited for 15189 or 17025. You need to be compliant with this standard, 15189, and you need to be in rule with your quality system for manufacturing this in-house IVD. So it's not necessary for the IVD regulation that you're accredited, but you need to know this standard because they see it as a good standard, the European regulation, that you do everything to work with as a medical laboratory and to comply to the measurements there for quality assurance.
Well, there is 3 more, I would say, little small questions. One is about definitional scale. You pointed out that this is not a fixed number. And I think there again, the guidance document is quite clear on how to define this. It's not because you do it quite some time in the lab that it becomes industrial. This is really conceptually quite interesting. That's for the industrial scale. Then the other thing is, of course, if you have one research use only or homemade kit in the whole procedure becomes LDT. That's what you stressed. So that's a clarification I wanted to give. If you say we're doing the whole exome sequencing with a number of CE kits and there is only one which is not CE, then you have to do the whole thing again, I trust.
Yes, but you can comply on all what you have from the CIVD kits, and then you have not so much work. You can say, yes, I use the kit like it is, I use the sample manual and then this and this. But if the sample manual is saying you cannot use that bioinformatic pipeline, this kit is CE marked, including the bioinformatic pipeline, then it's again, is this a significant change or not, modification, and therefore we are waiting for the updated one, and we already have the chance to look to what is available in the guideline that is now published.
And another question rehearses what has been said, that the cost or the increasing cost is not an argument against the use of a CE kit. So that's what I would like to clearly state, and there's no way out. The last question was one, and I think maybe I'm anticipating already too far. Wait, I got lost a little bit. It's the one on clinical studies, but maybe they can be answered later. If you are performing tests for clinical trials, do you also have to comply by the regulation? That's how I read that question. Maybe for Anja or
yes, it's really nice and good sessions to have it all. It was a clinical trial compared with the companion diagnostics. I have to read the question again clearly, but also the guidance now, what Jeroen Poels was mentioning about the MDCG document about clinical trials, and have the clinical trial regulation, which is now also published. How is that interpreted? That's the comparison. I have to check very carefully what's required. Under the IVDR, of course, it's clear requirements, what is needed, how the clinical trials have to be performed, and that you have to comply, for instance, with the ISO 20916, because that's state of the art. And you can look at Annex 13 and Annex 14 for the clinical trials requirements. I think that's really important. But now to have CTR also involved, I have to check carefully what's specifically mentioned on companion diagnostics.
I think else you want to add to this? I think the answer is quite clear.
No, I think what I would like to add, it's also important to look to your competent authority to see how they will implement that part, because the competent authority need to have a view on this also. So, and it can be different.
Approvals. Yeah.
I think we had all questions here. Else, you want to make a closing remark on this session? Do we have a poll right now?
We have a pool. Thanks for submitting them. I'm not sure if Oscar can share the results at the moment, but most of you, or nearly 60% of you, are sitting here in the webinar, and it's completely new working with these guidelines. So I think if you start reading these guidelines, you will be happy that you understand it better. You will not be happy to read them, perhaps, but you will understand better what the law is saying. So it's more our language, and you will say, yes, now I understand it. So for those, I think we have a good message. Question 2 was related to if you have already an overview which kind of test you are using, and most of you have not a good overview, so that's also something where you can work on. Not the most of you have an overview, but not enough detail to know what is the impact for our lab. So, but we are all working on it. So, and we will have now a break, and then we will come to some more practical issues related to, for those who would like to stay, related to the Dutch guideline. There will come someone who will explain more about software validation and how we need to handle this. And then we have a practical example from someone who already starting also to implement the IVD regulation. So I hope you will be all back.